A village haunted by its past. Nestled in the heart of the English countryside, the village of Wexley lay shrouded in an air of quiet unease. Its narrow, winding streets, lined with weathered cottages and overgrown gardens, seemed untouched by time, as if the world beyond had forgotten their existence. The church stood at the village's center, its spire broken and its stained glass windows clouded with age, casting an eerie glow across the cobbled square. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the occasional call of a crow from the skeletal branches of the ancient trees that surrounded the village. Despite its isolation, Wexley had long been a place of whispered stories and unspoken fears, its narrow winding streets lined with weathered cobbled square. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the occasional caw of eerie, past of a tragedy that had never been fully explained, of a family that had vanished without a trace, of a house that no one dared to enter. The village had a way of holding on to its secrets, and though the years had passed, the weight of its history still lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. It was this atmosphere of quiet dread that had drawn Inspector Margaret Harrow to Wexley. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for unearthing the most elusive of truths, she had been summoned to the village after a recent discovery, something that had sent ripples of unease through the tightly knit community. A body had been found near the old manor, its identity unknown, and the circumstances surrounding its death were shrouded in mystery. The local constabulary had been unable to find any leads, and the villagers, reluctant to speak of the past, had offered little more than vague, fearful glances. As she stepped onto the cobbled square, Harrow felt the weight of the village's history pressing against her. It was not just the physical decay of the buildings or the silence that surrounded her, but the sense that something unseen was watching, waiting. The past was not a distant memory in Wexley. It was a presence, an ever-present shadow that loomed over the village and its people. And now it had drawn her in, as if it had been waiting for her to come. A shadow from the past. Inspector Margaret Harrow had never been one to shy away from the past, but in Wexley it seemed to have a way of reaching out, grasping at her with unrelenting force. She had first come to the village as a young officer, fresh from the city and eager to prove herself. It had been a different time back then, when the weight of her own history had not yet settled on her shoulders like a second skin. The case that had brought her here now was not the first time she had stood in the shadow of Wexley's secrets, but it was the first time she felt as though the past was not merely a specter to be confronted, but a living thing that had been waiting for her return. She had left Wexley years ago, not by choice, but by necessity. The case that had taken her here had ended in a way that left her haunted, not by the crime itself, but by the knowledge that she had failed to see the full truth. A young girl had disappeared, and though she had done everything in her power to find her, the case had been closed before she could bring justice. The failure had left a scar that had never truly healed, and now, standing on the cobbled square once more, she could not shake the feeling that the past had not forgotten her either. Her mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, duty and personal history warring for dominance. She had come to Wexley to solve a mystery, to uncover the truth behind the recent discovery, but she knew that the past was not something that could be easily laid to rest. The village had a way of holding on to its secrets, of making them feel as though they were still alive, still breathing, and the case and personal history, warring for dominance. Now, as she walked through the narrow streets, she could not help but wonder if she was here not just to solve a crime, but to confront the ghosts that had followed her for so long. The weight of the past pressed against her, but she had no choice but to move forward. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. The past had haunted her before, and it would not do so again. Echoes of the forgotten. Wexley's past was not merely a collection of old stories whispered in the dark. It was a history that had shaped the village in ways both visible and unseen. Long before the arrival of the first settlers, the land had been the domain of the old gods, and though the village had long since abandoned its pagan roots, the remnants of that forgotten era still clung to the landscape. The ancient trees that lined the village square were said to be the guardians of the dead, their gnarled roots entwined with the bones of those who had perished in the village's earliest days. The old manor, with its crumbling facade and overgrown gardens, was the heart of this forgotten past, a place where time had stood still and where the air was thick with the weight of unspoken secrets. The villagers of Wexley had never been eager to speak of the past, but the stories had never truly disappeared. They lived on in the hushed conversations of the elderly, in the wary glances exchanged between neighbors, in the way that children would run from the old manor as though it were a place of danger rather than history. There were tales of the Wren family, who had once ruled the village with an iron grip before vanishing without a trace. Some claimed they had been cursed, others that they had simply disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. The most persistent legend spoke of the Whispering Woods, a dense forest that bordered the village and was said to be home to spirits that did not belong to the living world. Then there was the matter of the fire that had consumed the old chapel nearly a century ago. It had been a tragedy that had left the village in ruins, and though the cause had never been officially determined, the locals had long since accepted that it had been an act of God, a punishment for sins that had been buried with the past. But Harrow knew better than to believe in divine retribution. There were always secrets, always hidden truths that refused to be buried. And in Wexley, the past had a way of resurfacing when it was least expected. The village had tried to move on, to forget the tragedies that had shaped its history, but the past had never truly left. It lingered in the corners of the old buildings, in the silence of the church, in the way the winds seemed to whisper through the trees as if telling stories that no one dared to hear. And now, with the discovery of the body near the old manor, the past was no longer a distant memory. It was a presence waiting to be uncovered. Details they had managed to gather before her arrival: the body had been found near the old manor, partially buried beneath the roots of an ancient oak, its face obscured by the passage of time. The cause of death remained uncertain, but the position of the body suggested that it had not been placed there with any particular care, more like an afterthought, a thing left behind rather than a deliberate act. The villagers had been reluctant to speak of the discovery, their expressions tight with unease, as though the very act of acknowledging the body's presence would bring the past back to life. It was not until Harrow ventured beyond the village square, past the overgrown gardens and into the neglected grounds of the old manor, that she found the first true clue. The manor was a relic of naughty, a bygone era, its once grand facade, now a tangle of ivy and broken stone. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the silence was so complete that Harrow felt as though she were the only one who had ever set foot there. She moved carefully, her boots crunching against the uneven ground, her eyes scanning the remnants of what had once been a proud estate. Her attention was drawn to a small, weathered wooden box half buried in the roots of a nearby tree. It was not immediately obvious that it was there, but something about the way the earth had settled around it made her pause. She knelt, brushing away the dirt with careful hands, and as she did, a glint of metal caught the light. It was a key, worn and tarnished, but unmistakably, the half buried in the roots of a nearby tree. It was not immediately obvious that it was there, but Sefeld endured a maiden cock. Old. The moment she saw it, a chill ran through her. This was not just an ordinary key, it was a relic of the past, a piece of something that had been hidden for years. She turned it over in her hands, her mind racing with possibilities. The old manor had long been abandoned, but if this key had been hidden here, it had not been forgotten. Someone had left it, and someone had wanted to ensure that it remained buried. The question was, why? Harrow rose to her feet, her pulse quickening. This was the first tangible link between the present and the past, and it was not a coincidence. The past was not just a shadow in Wexley, it was a presence, and now it had left its mark in the form of a key that had been waiting to be found. A web of Secrets Inspector Margaret Harrow's discovery of the key had set her on a course that would take her deep into the tangled history of Wexley. The key, though worn and unassuming, was a piece of a puzzle that had long been buried. But to understand its significance, she needed to know more about the people who had once called the old manor home. The villagers, however, were not eager to speak of the past, and when she pressed them for information, their responses were hesitant, even hostile. She began with the oldest residents, those who had lived in Wexley for decades and had seen the village change in ways that others had not. Mr. Aldrich, the village historian, was the first to acknowledge the key's importance, though even he spoke in hushed tones. "That key," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "belonged to the Wren family. They were the ones who built the manor, but they vanished before the fire. Some say they were cursed, others that they were simply never meant to be found." His words were laced with an unspoken fear, and Harrow could not shake the feeling that he was withholding more than he was willing to share. As she moved through the village, she encountered others who were reluctant to speak of the past. A young woman named Eliza, who had grown up in the shadow of the manor, refused to look her in the eye when Harrow asked about the key. "It's not my place to talk about that," she said, her voice tight. "There are things that are better left forgotten." Her. Words were a warning, and Harrow knew that the villagers were not merely afraid of the past, they were afraid of what it might reveal. Her search for answers led her to the old vicarage, where she found the village's only surviving member of the Wren family. A reclusive woman named Eleanor Wren, now in her late 70s, had lived in the vicarage for most of her life, her presence a ghost of the past that had never fully faded. Harrow had expected resistance, but Eleanor was not as difficult to speak with as she had anticipated.
"I know what you're looking for," Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. "But I want to help you dig up the past."
Harrow met her gaze, unflinching.
"Then tell me why you're afraid."
At the edge of the table. "Because the past is not something that can be forgotten," she said at last. "It has a way of coming back, and when it does not come gently." Her words were a warning, but Harrow knew that the past had already begun to surface. The key was only the beginning, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized that Wexley's history was not just a series of forgotten tragedies. It was a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden, and now it was beginning to unravel. A stranger in the village, Inspector Margaret Harrow's search for answers had led her to a figure who seemed as much a part of Wexley's past as the village itself. Thomas Vale, a reclusive artist who had lived on the outskirts of forgotten tragedies. It was a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden. It was a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden. And now it was beginning to unravel. Over a decade, Vale was a man who had chosen to remain on the fringes, his presence acknowledged only by those who had the courage to seek him out. His home, a small cottage hidden behind the overgrown trees that bordered the village, was a place of quiet solitude, its windows often dark and its door rarely opened. Yet as Harrow approached, she felt a strange sense of inevitability, as though the path to the truth had led her here. She had heard whispers of Thomas Vale before, though never in detail. Some said he had once been a painter of great renown, his work exhibited in galleries across the country. Others claimed he had abandoned his art after a tragedy that had left him broken, retreating to Wexley to escape the world. Whatever the truth, Vale had become a ghost of the village, a man who had long since withdrawn from the lives of those around him. And now, as Harrow stood before his door, she could not shake the feeling that he had been waiting for her. The door creaked open with a sigh, revealing a man who was older than she had expected, his face lined with the weight of years and secrets. His eyes, sharp and watchful, studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being measured, assessed for something she did not yet understand. "You're the inspector," he said, his voice low and measured. "You're the inspector," he said, his voice low and measured. "I knew you would come." Harrow raised an eyebrow. "You knew?" Vale did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The cottage was dimly lit, the air. She could not shake the feeling that he had been waiting for her. The door creaked.
You're the inspector?"
Thick with the scent of old paint and dust. Shelves lined the walls, filled with canvases that had not been touched in years. Some of the paintings were of the village, but others were of places she did not recognize. Dark, shadowed landscapes that seemed almost otherworldly.
"I have been watching the village for a long time,"
Vale said at last, his voice carrying a weight that suggested more than mere observation.
"I have seen things that others have not, and I have known the past in ways that few ever will."
Harrow studied him carefully, her mind racing with possibilities.
"Then you know what happened to the Wren family?"
Vale's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, as though he had been expecting this question.
"I know what they left behind," he said. "Others have not. What is wait George? What is waste? What is March? What is? I have known the past in ways that few ever will."
Harrow studied him carefully, her mind racing with possibilities. "Then you know what happened to the Wren family?" Vale's expecting this question. "I know that the past is not something that can be buried forever." His words sent a chill through Harrow. She had come to Wexley to uncover the truth, but now, standing in the presence of Thomas Vale, she was beginning to suspect that the past was not merely a mystery to be solved. It was a force that had been waiting for her to return. The hidden room inspector Margaret Harrow's visit to Thomas Vale had left her with more questions than answers, but it had also given her a new direction. Vale had spoken in riddles, his words laced with a knowledge that suggested he had been watching the village for years, perhaps even longer. He had hinted at something hidden, something that had been buried beneath the surface of Wexley's history, and now, with the key in her possession, Harrow felt that she was on the verge of uncovering it. The key, worn and tarnished, had not led her to any obvious place in the village, but Vale had given her a cryptic clue. A name, Eleanor Wren. It was a name that had long been associated with the old manor, and now, with the weight of the past pressing against her, Harrow knew that she had to find the woman who had once lived there. She returned to the old manor, her steps determined as she moved through the overgrown grounds, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The manor had changed little since her last visit, but now, with a new purpose driving her forward, she noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. The ivy-covered walls bore the marks of old, deliberate carvings, as A, and the broken stone steps led to a door that had been sealed for decades. She traced the outline of the carvings with her fingers, her mind racing with possibilities. This was not just a forgotten building, it was a place that had been deliberately hidden, its secrets locked away. She turned the key in the lock, and with a groan of rusted metal, the door creaked open. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of old wood, and as she stepped inside, the dim light from the window revealed a room that had been untouched for years. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture was draped in cloth, as though it had been abandoned in a single moment. But it was not the furniture that caught her attention. It was the bookshelf that stood at the far end of the room. On the shelf, a single book lay open, its pages yellowed with age. The title was faded, but the name on the cover was unmistakable: Eleanor Wren. Harrow's heart pounded as she reached for the book, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink faded but still legible. It was a diary, a record of Eleanor Wren's life, and as she read, the pieces of the past began to fall into place. The entries spoke of a family that had once lived in the manor, of a tragedy that had once lived in the manor, of a tragedy that had been buried and forgotten. Eleanor had written of the fire that had consumed the chapel, of the Wren family's sudden disappearance, of a secret that had been kept hidden for. The title was a diary, a record of Eleanor Wren's life, and as she read, the pieces of the past began to fall into place. The entries spoke of a family that had once lived in the manor, of a tragedy that had been buried and forgotten. Decades. And then, at the very end of the diary, she had written a single line that sent a chill through Harrow's spine. The past does not stay buried. It waits for the right moment to return. The words were not just a warning. They were a revelation. The past had not been forgotten. It had been waiting, and now it was coming back. The weight of the past. Inspector Margaret Harrow's hands trembled as she closed the diary, the weight of its revelations pressing down on her like a physical force. The past was no longer a distant memory, no longer a shadow lurking in the corners of Wexley's history. It was alive, and it had been waiting for her to find it. The diary had confirmed what she had long suspected. The Wren family had not vanished by accident. Their disappearance had been deliberate, and the fire that had consumed the chapel had not been an act of divine retribution, but something far more sinister. She stepped back from the bookshelf, her mind racing. If Eleanor Wren had known the truth, then someone had ensured that it remained hidden. The villagers had been reluctant to speak of the past, but now Harrow understood why. They had been protecting a secret that had been buried for decades, and now, with the key in her possession and the diary in her hands, she was standing on the precipice of something that could change everything. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, but Harrow could not ignore the feeling that she was being watched. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting to find someone lurking in the shadows. The silence was oppressive, and for a moment she felt as though she were not alone. Then a faint creak echoed from the hallway, and she froze. The sound was not the only thing that had changed. The past was no longer just a ghost. It was a presence, and now it was moving. She forced herself to take a step forward, her breath shallow as she moved toward the door. The key still clung to her fingers, and though she had no idea where it would lead her, she knew that the next clue was waiting just beyond the threshold. The past had been buried, but it was not done with her. As she stepped out into the dim light of the overgrown garden, Harrow felt the weight of the village pressing against her. Wexley had always been a place of secrets, of stories that had been left to fade into obscurity. But now, with the diary in her hands and the truth beginning to take shape, she knew that the past was not something that could be ignored. It had been waiting for her, and now it was time to face it. The unraveling truth. Inspector Margaret Harrow moved through the village with a renewed sense of purpose, her mind racing with the implications of what she had uncovered. The diary had confirmed what she had long suspected. The Wren family had not disappeared by accident. Their disappearance had been deliberate, and the fire that had consumed the chapel had been a calculated act, not a punishment from the heavens. But the deeper she delved, the more she realized that the truth was not as simple as she had once believed. She returned to the village square, her steps measured as she approached the old vicarage. Eleanor Wren had been the only surviving member of the Wren family, and Harrow knew that the answer she was seeking lay with the woman who had lived in the shadow of the past for decades. The door to the vicarage creaked open before she could knock, and Eleanor Wren stood at the threshold, her face lined with the weight of years and secrets. "I knew you would come," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. "You found the diary, haven't you?" Harrow nodded. "Yes, and I know that the Wren family's disappearance was not an accident. Someone made sure that they were gone, and—" The fire was part of it. Eleanor's expression did not change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or sorrow. "You're right," she said, "but you don't understand the full truth. The past is not just something that was buried. It was protected." Harrow's pulse quickened. "By whom?" Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Harrow to enter. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and dust. She led Harrow to a small table in the corner where a single object lay waiting, another key identical to the one Harrow had found at the manor.
"This is the key to the final secret," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one that was never meant to be found."
A roe fawn's crest. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and dust. She led Harrow to a small table in the corner, where a single object lay waiting, another key identical to the one Harrow had found at the manor. For the key, her mind racing with the implications. The past had been buried, but now it was beginning to surface once more, and with it the truth that had been hidden for so long was finally coming to light. The weight of the past. Inspector Margaret Harrow stood in the dimly lit room, the key in her hand, the weight of the past pressing down on her like an invisible force. The truth had been uncovered, but it was not a revelation that brought clarity. It was a burden, a truth that could never be undone. The Wren family had not simply vanished. They had been silenced, their voices stolen by those who had feared the consequences of their knowledge. The fire that had consumed the chapel had not been an accident, but an act of deliberate erasure, a eerie, final attempt to ensure that the past remained buried. Eleanor Wren had not spoken of it willingly, but her silence had been a testament to the fear that had kept the truth hidden for so long. The villagers of Wexley had known, in some way, that the past had not been forgotten. It had been protected, and now, with the key in her possession, Harrow understood that the past had not been meant to be found. It had been waiting, watching, and now it had been unearthed. She turned the key over in her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. It was not just a key over in her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. The past had shaped Wexley, had been locked away for decades. The past had shaped Wexley, had defined it, had left its mark on every stone, every whisper in the wind. And now it had come back to haunt the present. As she stepped outside, the village seemed to shift around her, the air thick with the weight of history. The past had not been forgotten, and it never would be. It had always been waiting, and now it had found her. She took a deep breath, the wind carrying the scent of damp earth and old wood. The mystery had been solved, but the truth was not something that could be erased. The past had come back, and it would never be silenced again. Shadows that remain. As Inspector Margaret Harrow walked away from the old vicarage, the weight of the past pressed against her like a phantom that would not be shaken. The mystery of Wexley had been unraveled, but the truth had not brought closure. It had only deepened the understanding that some secrets could never be fully buried. The Wren family had been silenced, their voices stolen by those who had feared the consequences of their knowledge. The fire that had consumed the chapel had not been an accident, but a deliberate act, a final attempt to erase a past that had long been hidden. She had come to Wexley seeking answers, but in the end, she had found something far more complex than she had expected. The past was not a distant memory to be uncovered and laid to rest. It was a living force, one that had shaped the village and its people in ways that could not be undone. The villagers had known in some way that the past had not been forgotten. It had been protected, and now it had been unearthed. As she stepped onto the cobbled square, the village around her seemed to shift, as though the very air had changed. The silence that had once been oppressive now carried the weight of history, of stories that had been left to fade into obscurity. The past had come back, not as a ghost to be exorcised, but as a presence that would remain, forever woven into the fabric of Wexley. Harrow looked back one last time, her gaze lingering on the old manor, its crumbling facade a testament to the secrets that had been locked away for so long. She had solved the mystery, but she knew that the past would never be forgotten. It had come back to haunt the present, and now it would remain, a shadow that would never be fully cast aside. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.